All right, so we're back and ready to really dig into this stuff. You guys sent us like a ton of information about California policies, programs, all sorts of things that are shaping how life is in the Golden State. And that's kind of what we're all about here, right? We take what you give us, we break it down.
Yeah, kind of like I guess like a cheat sheet for California living, maybe. And I gotta say, it's quite a mix. I mean, we're talking everything from how they legally define emotional support animals, which is something I know a lot of people are curious about, to like the nitty-gritty of end-of-life care, which is obviously a super sensitive topic. And we've even got stuff on the whole employee versus independent contractor thing, which, let me tell you, can be a real headache in California.
Oh, absolutely. And then you throw in things like mental health parity. Then there's all those details on how California handles gender identity, specific rules for schools, and just a bunch of programs aimed at supporting families.
It's a lot, right?
Yeah, it's like a snapshot of what makes California, well, California, but it's a lot to digest, right?
Right.
So we're going to try to pull out those key insights, the things that might make you go, huh, didn't know that. Or maybe those moments where you're like, okay, that actually makes a lot more sense now.
All right, let's do it.
Perfect. So let's jump right in. How about we tackle something that, I don't know, just seems to be a bit of a hot topic these days. Emotional support animals. You see them everywhere, right? People have a lot of feelings about them. But California's got like a whole legal structure around them.
Yeah, and I think what might surprise some folks is just how specific the regulations are. Like California defines an ESA, emotional support animal, as one that provides emotional support, cognitive support, or similar to a person with a disability. And a big difference compared to service animals is they don't need specialized training or certification.
Oh, that's right. That's a key distinction. But it's not like you can just like download a certificate from the internet.
Nope, nope, not at all. You have to have a relationship with a qualified provider for at least 30 days before they can even issue you that documentation. Now, what's interesting is it doesn't say anything about the number of sessions or anything like that. It's just that 30-day mark.
Huh, so no cutting corners. You actually have to, like, establish that connection with a real professional. So what else is in this documentation?
So besides that 30-day relationship, the provider also has to do a clinical evaluation to figure out if the person really needs the ESA. It's got to be based on a real assessment, not just a friend saying, oh, yeah, you totally need a puppy.
Right, gotta be legit.
Exactly. And the person providing the documentation, they got to have a license, a valid active license in the state or jurisdiction where the person lives. And that includes psychologists, obviously, but also those psychological associates and registrants. And their license number has to be on the documentation, like front and center.
Oh, wow, so they can really track it back.
Yep, accountability. But here's the thing. There's also this legal notice, a really important one. It's in the penal code, which is where all the criminal laws in California are. And it basically says that if you try to fake being the owner or trainer of an ESA, that's a misdemeanor. Like you can get in actual legal trouble.
So definitely not something to mess around with. It's serious stuff. All right, let's shift gears completely here. Let's talk about, well, the end of life. California's got this End of Life Option Act, and it allows people who are terminally ill to request medication to help them die. It's obviously a very personal and sensitive subject.
It really is. And, I think it speaks to like this idea of personal autonomy, right?
Mm.
Especially when you're facing a terminal illness. But of course, there are very specific, strict rules around this option.
Yeah, it's definitely not just available to everyone. You have to meet very particular criteria.
Absolutely. First off, you got to be a California resident.
Yeah.
And the request has to come directly from the person themselves. No family members or anyone else can do it for them.
Mhm. Wow, so it really emphasizes that it's their choice and their choice alone.
Yep. And it has to be documented. A formal request. And probably the biggest thing is that they have to be physically and mentally able to take the medication themselves. Like no one else can administer it.
So it's really about giving them control at the very end within those very specific legal boundaries. Okay, let's talk about something a little different now. Healthcare access. Specifically, this early and periodic screening, diagnosis and treatment program. It's quite a mouthful.
It is. It is. EPSDT, they call it. And it's basically a preventative care program. It's meant for low-income folks under 21 who are on Medi-Cal, which is California's version of Medicaid. And what it does is it makes sure these young people get screenings, diagnoses, and any necessary treatments to catch potential health problems early on.
So it's about being proactive,
Yeah.
catching things before they become big problems.
Exactly. Especially for those who might not have regular access to health care otherwise.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, mental health. Huge topic these days. And California's got this thing called the Mental Health Parity Act. What does that actually mean for people who need mental health care?
This is a really important law. It basically says that insurance plans and disability insurance, they have to cover diagnosis and treatment for severe mental illnesses for everyone, all ages. And for kids, it covers serious emotional disturbance. The key is that it has to be covered under the same terms as any other medical condition. So, they can't make you jump through more hoops or charge you more just because it's mental health.
So, no more double standards when it comes to mental health.
That's the idea. And it gets even better. The coverage also has to include substance use disorders because, let's face it, those two often go hand in hand, and they can't just limit it to short-term or acute treatment either.
Right, because mental health issues, they're often like ongoing long-term things, not just a quick fix.
Absolutely, it recognizes that. So what kind of services are we talking about here? Well, basic health care, different levels of care, and even prescription drugs that are related to mental health and substance use. It's pretty comprehensive.
Okay, so it's not just limited to therapy then, but, insurance companies, they love to talk about what's medically necessary, right? So how does the law deal with that?
That's a good question because it all comes down to how it's actually applied, right?
Ooh.
So the law says that when insurance companies are deciding if a treatment is medically necessary, they got to use the generally accepted standards of care, both for mental health and substance use. And they have to develop very specific guidelines. The important thing is they can't use different, stricter rules for mental health or substance use than they do for other conditions.
Oh, so it tries to prevent them from, like, unfairly denying coverage.
Right. But what happens if they don't follow the rules? Well, the Department of Managed Healthcare, they can slap them with penalties, fines, basically. So there are consequences for not playing by the rules.
That's good to know. Oh, and there's also this thing about insurance companies having, like, discretionary authority.
Yeah. That's super important for patient rights. Basically, any part of an insurance plan that says they get to decide who's eligible for what, that's void, not enforceable in California. So they can't just, make up their own rules. They have to stick to the established standards.
That's a big win for patients, right? Okay, let's switch gears again. Let's talk about something that affects, like, a lot of people in the workforce, including mental health professionals, the whole employee versus independent contractor thing. It seems like California's got some strong opinions on that.
Oh, yeah. Back in 2018, they had this Dynamex case, and it basically said that unless you meet some very specific criteria, you're probably an employee, not a contractor, even if you think you're a contractor,
Hmm.
at least for things like wages and benefits. And initially, there were some exemptions for certain professions, doctors, lawyers, psychologists, those kinds of folks.
But then they kind of changed things up a bit, right?
They did. They passed this law, AB 2257, in 2020. And it clarified some things, added some more exemptions, especially for certain business-to-business relationships. But overall, it's still pretty strict. Like, if you want to be considered a true independent contractor in California, you got to meet a whole list of criteria, 12 to be exact.
12. That sounds pretty intense.
It is. And here's the kicker. You got to meet all 12, all of them. If you miss even one, boom, employee status. So let's walk through some of the highlights because I think this is something everyone should understand, whether you're hiring or being hired.
All right, lay it on us.
So first off, you got to actually have a legitimate business, not just like doing some side gigs. And you got to be free from control by the company that's hiring you. Like, they can't be telling you exactly how to do your work. You got to be doing work directly for them, not their customers.
Okay, so clear lines of who you're actually working for.
Right. Then there's the paperwork stuff. You got to have a written contract that spells out the payment details, how much,
Yeah.
when you get paid, all of that. And you got to have all the necessary licenses and be registered to pay taxes. Like, you got to be running a real official business.
Makes sense.
Okay.
What about the physical space?
Ideally, you should have your own separate business location, not just working from the company's office. And the work you're doing, it has to be in line with what your business normally does. Not just some random gig that's totally unrelated.
Oh, sticking to your expertise.
Right. And you got to be able to take on other clients at the same time. The company you're working for can't stop you from doing that. And you got to be out there marketing your services to the public, showing everyone that you're open for business.
So being a true independent contractor, not just like exclusively working for one company.
Exactly. You got to use your own tools and equipment too. And you should be able to negotiate your own rates.
Yeah.
And this is a big one. You got to be able to set your own hours and decide where you work. If they're dictating your schedule and location, That's a red flag.
It's like a whole checklist for independence, right?
Mhm.
Okay, let's move on to some of the specific programs and committees. There's this Office of Suicide Prevention, which, I mean, that just sounds incredibly important.
Yeah, it's pretty crucial. So the State Department of Public Health, they're the ones who are allowed to set up this office, and their main job would be to get grants and funding for suicide prevention programs. They'd also be working with the Mental Health Services Oversight and Accountability Commission, which we'll talk about later. But the idea is to really coordinate efforts across different organizations and agencies.
Makes sense. Working together is key, especially for something as complex as suicide prevention. We also saw something about peer support teams for first responders. That seems like a really valuable idea.
It does, right? I mean, firefighters, police officers, they deal with so much stress and trauma on the job. So the law says they can create these peer support teams where first responders can get support from people who actually understand what they're going through.
It's like, who better to help you than someone who's been there themselves, right?
Exactly. But the documents also raise this interesting point about, like, mandatory reporting. Mental health professionals, they often have to report certain things. So it's unclear how those rules would apply to these peer support teams. It's something they need to figure out carefully.
Yeah, definitely a tricky situation. They'd need to balance confidentiality with those legal obligations. Okay, another thing that caught our eye was the push to certify peer support specialists in the mental health field.
Oh, that's a really interesting development. So the idea is that people who have lived experience with mental illness or substance use, they can become certified peer support specialists.
Mhm.
And then they can use their experience to help others who are going through similar challenges.
So it's like bringing in that lived experience perspective to the system, right?
Exactly. And the state's going to set up some requirements,
Hmm.
but the counties will actually run the programs. They can even charge fees for them, but the state has to approve everything. And they might even do some pilot projects in certain counties.
Sounds promising. Okay, we also saw something about an early psychosis and mood disorder detection and intervention committee. That sounds like a pretty specific focus.
It is. They basically advise on how to, well, detect and intervene early when someone might be developing psychosis or a mood disorder. The sooner you catch these things, the better the chances of a good outcome. And they'd be funded by donations and grants.
Early intervention is so key. Now, this Mental Health Services Oversight and Accountability Commission, they seem to have a pretty big job on their hands.
Oh, yeah, they're kind of like the watchdogs of the mental health system in California. Their big thing is making sure that people with mental illness and their families have a real voice in how the system works.
So it's not just decisions being made by, like, bureaucrats and policymakers.
Right. They want to make sure the people who are actually affected are heard. And the commission is made up of 16 members. 2 of them have to be people who've experienced mental illness themselves, and 2 have to be mental health professionals. And the governor appoints them all. Plus, they can even have a fellowship program where people can learn about the system and become experts.
Sounds like a way to bring in lots of different perspectives. Okay, let's talk about some things related to gender identity. There's this Transgender Wellness and Equity Fund. What's that all about?
So this fund, it sits under the Office of Health Equity,
Mhm.
and it's basically there to give grants to organizations that help transgender, gender nonconforming, and intersex people. They call it the TGI community.
Mm.
And it's all about funding those specific programs and services that they need.
So it's recognizing that they have unique needs that might not be met by, like, general services.
Yes, exactly. They want to create or support housing programs specifically for TGI folks. And they want to help connect TGI organizations with healthcare providers who are actually knowledgeable about their needs. And they want those providers to offer training to other healthcare professionals so everyone's more informed.
It's about making sure they have access to appropriate and sensitive care, right?
Yeah.
Okay, then there's the Gender Recognition Act. That seems to have made some big changes.
Oh, yeah. This act basically lets people change the gender marker on their birth certificate. They just have to submit an application and an affidavit saying that they want to change it to match their gender identity. And it's got to be for a legitimate reason, not like to commit fraud or something.
And didn't it used to be a lot harder to do that?
It did. Before, you often had to prove that you'd had medical or surgical treatment to change your gender. But now, they recognize that gender identity is about how you see yourself, not about what procedures you've had. They also made it so minors can go to court and get their name and gender legally changed, whether it's to female, male, or non-binary.
So a lot more flexibility and recognition there. And what about driver's licenses?
The DMV, They've been offering female, male, or non-binary as gender options since 2019. And if a minor gets their gender and name changed in court, those records are confidential. They get to decide who has access to that information.
Really important to protect their privacy, especially at that age. Now, what about psychologists who want to change their name or gender on their license?
The Board of Psychology, they've got a process for that. They'll change it on your license and in all their records, and they'll even issue you a new license with your updated information.
So they're being pretty accommodating there. What if someone's had disciplinary action against them?
In those cases, they won't post the details online. They'll just say that the person had some kind of action taken against them and provide a way for people to get more information. But the actual records about the name and gender change, those are kept confidential.
It's a balance between transparency and privacy. Okay, let's talk about schools. There's this new rule about guns in school zones, right?
Yeah. Basically, school superintendents, they can't give people permission to have guns on school grounds anymore. There's an exception for like certified hunter education programs and things like that. But the general rule is no guns.
So tightening up the rules there makes sense. And what about sexual harassment on college campuses?
California's pretty serious about that. They've got a whole bunch of rules that state-funded colleges have to follow. They got to have a non-discrimination policy, and they have to train all their employees on sexual harassment prevention.
So it's not just like a one-time thing.
Nope. They got to have a dedicated person who handles sexual harassment complaints. And they have to have clear procedures for dealing with those complaints. And they have to put all that information online, and they got to tell employees that they're legally required to report any sexual harassment they see.
So they're really trying to create a culture of awareness and accountability.
Exactly. Especially on campuses with dorms. They have to do this training every year. They're not messing around.
Good. Okay, let's talk about some programs for families. Domestic violence is considered a valid reason for a kid to not be in school under the CalWORKs program, right?
That's right. CalWORKs is California's welfare program, and they recognize that if there's domestic violence happening at home, it can really mess with a kid's ability to go to school and learn. And if someone's fleeing domestic violence, they're automatically considered homeless and can get temporary help, even if their abuser has money.
So it's about getting them to safety no matter what.
Exactly. And for older foster kids, they've got these transitional housing programs. They help kids who are 16 or older, and even young adults up to 21, find a place to live. They can live with a host family in a group home, or even get help finding their own apartment.
So it's like a bridge to independence for them.
Exactly. And the people who run these programs, they can even co-sign leases for these young adults. And regular foster families can be host families too, as long as they're still certified.
That's great. So many options for them. And what about like child support?
Both parents are legally required to financially support their kids. And California has these guidelines that the courts use to figure out how much child support someone should pay. They look at things like income and the child's needs.
So it's not just like a random number they pull out of a hat?
Nope. It's all based on these established guidelines. And when it comes to foster kids' school records, there are specific rules about who can see them.
So not just anyone can access those records.
Right. It's got to be people who are directly involved in the child's care, like staff at group homes, foster parents, relatives who are caring for the child. They all have the right to see those records, even if they're not technically the child's educational rights holder.
But they still have to communicate with the rights holder. Right.
Absolutely. They got to tell the rights holder about any educational needs the child has.
Hmm.
But if they can't talk to the rights holder directly, they have to tell the social worker or the child's lawyer. And the courts have to check up on the child's education and well-being every 6 months.
So there's a system of checks and balances there. And lastly, let's talk about what it takes to become a foster parent, or what they call a resource family in California.
Yeah. So if you want to be a resource family, you got to do at least 12 hours of training before you can even be considered. They teach you about how to provide a stable home, how to help kids who've been through trauma, and how to support their education.
So they really prepare you for the challenges.
Oh, yeah. And they have to check out your home to make sure it's safe. And they'll keep checking up on you even after you become a resource family.
Wow. It's a lot more involved than most people probably realize.
It is. But it's important work.
Absolutely. Wow, we've covered so much ground here. We've talked about emotional support animals, end-of-life care, worker classification, mental health programs, gender identity, school policies, and support for families. It's amazing how much the law impacts our lives, even in ways we don't always realize.
It's true. California's legal and regulatory framework is so comprehensive, it really touches on just about every aspect of life in the state.
For me, some of the things that really stand out are those specific rules around ESAs, and then that super detailed test for independent
Mhm.
contractors, and the fact that you don't have to have medical treatment to change your gender marker anymore. That's a big deal.
Yeah, those are all significant changes. And what really struck me is how California is constantly trying to find that balance between individual rights and the state's role in protecting and supporting its people,
Yeah.
like with the Mental Health Parity Act, or how they're trying to help foster kids and people fleeing domestic violence.
It's like a constant push and pull between those two forces. So, for you listening out there, I want you to think about this. With all these policies and programs, what do you think are the biggest hurdles California faces in actually making them work? And could there be any unintended consequences from having such a complex system? It's something to ponder.
It definitely is. And we hope that by taking this deep dive with us, you've gained a better understanding in all these issues that are shaping life in California today.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time.